The first time I've actually heard Bix Beiderbecke was on a sort of detective story called the Beiderbecke Tape, and I think it featured James Bolam. And I enjoyed the programme, but I enjoyed the music tremendously. But I thought that Bix must be a clarinet player because the tune they featured on the programme as an introduction was featuring a clarinet. So that's what I thought, but he actually plays the cornet. So this is called Bix Beiderbecke and the Jazz Age, and it's from The History of Jazz by Ted Gioia or something. Bix Beiderbecke and the Jazz Age. The compact geography of early jazz, as it is commonly told, is deceptively simple. Drawing its ebb and flow on a map, we seem to find ourselves staring at a sharply articulated triangle formed by three urban centres. The starting point is New Orleans, next comes Chicago, and finally New York. So much of our history flows along this closed loop that we are tempted to ignore the rest of the map. Yet the Jazz Age was not confined to these three cities, or even 30 or 300. Probing deeper into the mythology of early jazz, we see the Mississippi River immortalized as the music's lifeline, inspiring the blues roots of the music and eventually transporting jazz by riverboat to its second home, Chicago. The story is charming, however, the map will not oblige us this time. The Mississippi skirts Chicago by a wide margin. When Louis Armstrong travelled to Chicago to join King Oliver Creole Jazz Band, he arrived by train. And years before Armstrong's fateful trip, countless other New Orleans jazz musicians had already journeyed by train and other means, not only to Chicago, but throughout the United States, and in some instances overseas. A number of early jazz players have left behind memoirs of these early years, and their tales of nomadic adventures almost overshadow the stories of the music. These various sources do, however, agree on one point. Almost from the start, jazz music went on the road. These itinerant jazzmen were not alone in their missionary work for the new music. The phonograph record, even more than the musicians themselves, would play a crucial role in the disseminating the creative fruits of New Orleans jazz in all who cared to listen. As early as 1909, some $12 million worth in phonograph records and cylinders at wholesale prices was manufactured in the United States. Only 12 years later, sales were running at 4 times that level, reaching $47.8 million. This tremendous growth set the stage for a substantial increase in the recording of jazz music over the next several years. Our knowledge of jazz before the early 1920s is mostly based on hearsay, but from this point on, recordings document the intricate and varied evolution of the music. The complex synergism between technologies and of dissemination and the growth of African American music can only be hinted at here, but even when it is sketched in broad brushstrokes, one cannot ignore the telling pattern. The growth of ragtime takes place in conjunction with the spread of parlour pianos, mechanical pianos, and mass-produced sheet music. Then the blossoming of early jazz and blues occurs in tandem with the nascent market for recordings. Still ahead in our story lies the birth of the swing era, a history that took place in large measure over the airways. Record sales had collapsed with the Great Depression, falling almost 40% in 1930 alone, with many listeners now tuning to broadcasts, not the phonograph, for their music. Previously, the musical celebrities may have made broadcasts, but by the late 1930s, in a telling flip-flop, the broadcasts now made the celebrities, now created the audience for live music, now set the agenda for the musical tastes of the nation. The medium is the music, a truism that is much today as at the dawn of jazz. Who can doubt that the downloading of music files are the platform for jazz careers in the new millennium, just as 78s and radio broadcasts were in an earlier day. In truth, the entire history of jazz finds the music periodically adapting and responding to the new technologies of distribution and dissemination as they emerge. It would be hard to conceive of Bix Beiderbecke becoming a jazz musician without the intervention of technology. In this case, a Columbia gramophone that entered the Beiderbecke household circa 1918. Davenport, Iowa, where Leon Bix Beiderbecke was born on March 10, 1903, may have been, as often pointed out, a riverboat stop, albeit some 1,000 miles distance from New Zealand, 1,000 miles distant from New Orleans, and even further from New Zealand. Anyway, from New Orleans. But the span in miles was small compared to the even greater gap in culture, demographics, and attitude between the two cities. If New Orleans was a city immersed in music, Davenport was a community steeped in, what else, cornfields. By Davenport standards, the Beiderbeckes were a musical family. Bix's grandfather had led the Deutsche Amerikanische Choral Society before the turn of the century, but brass dance bands, funeral parades and blues singing played no part in their musical heritage. By almost any measure, the city and the household were an unlikely setting for the education of a jazz legend. Bix's older brother, Charles, who returned from service in World War I, owned this phonograph player and a few records, including the popular jazz side made some months earlier by the original Dixieland Jazz Band. The playing of Nick LaRocca, the standout cornetist with the ODJB, made an especially strong impression on Bix. Excited by the music, Bix announced to his befuddled parents his aspiration to learn to play jazz on the cornet. Their attempts to discourage this interest failed. Bix purchased a used horn with his allowance money and began teaching himself how to play. At this point he had already studied the piano as early as 1910. As early as 1910, the Davenport Chronicle ran an article about the 7-year-old Beiderbecke who, it claimed, can play any selection he hears on the piano entirely by ear. Soon he was applying the same native talent with even greater fervour to his new instrument. Beiderbecke's noted ear for music would take him far, but like his idol, LaRocca, and many other jazz players, Bix used it as a crutch, as a way of avoiding the rigours of formal study. His early piano lessons were deemed, despite the youngster's talent, a failure. Beiderbecke never learnt to read music fluently, since it was much easier for him to play the lesson by ear. The same mixture of precociousness and studied nonchalance marks his approach to the cornet. Not only did his reading skills fail to improve on the new instrument, but in his attempts to teach himself, Bix adopted an unusual dry embouchure and fell into a habit of using unconventional fingerings, which he stuck with even after the proper method was pointed out to him. No doubt a characteristic streak of obstinacy underlay his chronic disregard for the tried and true. Years later, Beiderbecke was equally stubborn in continuing to play the cornet long after most of his contemporaries had switched to the trumpet. In so many... maybe I can splice it with nobody noticing. In so many aspects of his life, Beiderbecke was determined to do things his way or not at all. Wary of their child's growing interest in jazz music, perhaps rightly given Beiderbecke's later fatal adoption of all the worst habits of the jazz lifestyle, Bix's parents decided that firm action was required. The youngster was enrolled in a boarding school where, they hoped, he would pick up a solid education and greater self-discipline. In retrospect, the decision was fated for failure from the start, for their chosen school, Lake Forest Academy, was situated only a short train ride away from Chicago, then rapidly becoming the jazz capital of the world. The worst that Bix could have done in Davenport paled in comparison to the potential for trouble in this new setting. Within a short time of his arrival at the academy, Bix was regularly violating the strict curfew regulations. Their disregard would eventually lead to his dismissal, and haunting the various night spots of Chicago and its environs. At first, Bix went on these midnight expeditions simply to listen and occasionally to sit in with various bands, but as word of his prowess on the cornet spread, he began performing with his own group, composed of a mix of Lake Forest Academy co-conspirators and ringers from Chicago. After his expulsion from Lake Forest Academy, Bix must have recognised that his passport to a career would never be reached through an Ivy League degree, although Bix would hatch occasional plans to return to his studies for years, but by means of his cornet and ear for music. Beiderbecke's first major band, the Wolverines, brought together a group of like-minded instrumentalists. These all but unknown young jazz devotees took their inspiration primarily from the performance of the New Orleans Rhythm Kings. During that band's engagement at Friar's Inn, members of Bix's circle were frequently in attendance, listening, learning, sometimes sitting in with the group. A chance to put this education into practice came in October 1923, when clarinetist Jim Hartwell succeeded in obtaining regular employment for the Wolverines at the Stockton Club, located 17 miles north of Cincinnati. Performances here and at other venues in this area gave the musicians ample opportunity to refine their crafts and develop an enthusiastic local following. But greater fame would have been inconceivable this far distant from the major musical capitals of America, had not the Wolverines secured an opportunity to spend a day recording at the Gannett recording studio in Richmond, Indiana, some 125 miles away from Cincinnati. This was a turning point not only in documenting the band's progress to date, but also in reinforcing the confidence of this group of novices to the music industry. No amount of words would adequately describe the excitement and utter amazement of that first recording, played back to us for correction of positions around the recording horns, recorded George Johnson, tenorist with the group. I doubt if any of us realised until that moment how different in style and how dissimilar in effect our results were from the music of the Friars Band that had thrilled us all so barely months before. Beiderbecke's debut recordings with the Wolverines only hinted at the potential for the young cornetist. His solos, for all their poise, are melodically simple by comparison with the work he would create over the next several years. Evidence of Beiderbecke's sensitivity to altered tones is apparent. Even his use of flatted fifths and ninths in his work on Riverboat Shuffle. But one also notes the relaxed delivery, so characteristic of Bix's phrasing. Above all, the expressive, at times haunting tone of Beiderbecke's cornet demands our attention. Bix may not have mastered the dirty, rough-edged sound of a King Oliver, a style vastly influential in this stage of history of jazz, nor do his solos burst forth with the unbridled energy that Armstrong would soon bring to the music. But they sing in a way that was unique in the context of mid-1920s jazz. Not so much played, they sounded as though they lofted gently from the bell of his horn, left to float in the stream of warm air. Eddie Condon, a collaborator of Beiderbecke's, also sensed an invitation in Bix's sound, like a girl saying yes, was his oft-quoted appraisal of his initial encounter with it. For the first time I realised that music isn't all the same, that some people play so differently from others that it becomes an entirely new set of sounds. Hoagy Carmichael, grabbing for an even odder allusion, saw Bix's music affecting him in a different way. Can't tell you how. Like a licorice, you have to eat some. Bix's breaks were not as wild as Armstrong's, but they were hot, and he selected each note with musical care. He showed me that jazz could be musical and beautiful as well as hot. To Mesmero, Beiderbecke's tone was pickled in alcohol. I have never heard a tone like that, like he got before or since. He played mostly open horn, every note full, big, rich and round, standing out like a pearl, loud but never irritating or jangling, with a powerful drive that few white musicians had in those days. Louis Armstrong recalled Beiderbecke's performance in Chicago in the mid-1920s, simply said, "I'm telling you, those pretty notes went right through me." A pearl or a girl, licorice, lick or liquor, these poetic comparisons may strike some listeners today as being at odds with the body of work that Beiderbecke's left behind. Studio technology of the 1920s did not serve the cornetist well. Records never quite reproduced his sound, Pee Wee Russell attested, with many others concurring in that judgment. Acoustic recordings, with their use of a single horn to capture music and trace it mechanically into grooves on a wax disc, presented modern-day fans, weaned on the crystal clarity of digital technology, with a flattened one-dimensional sound. Like shadows in Plato's cave, these artifacts from audio's earliest days are merely indicative, not truly representative, of the absent originals. And electric recordings launched in the mid-1920s sound only marginally better. This innovation was slow to demonstrate its advantages, so much so that at the time many listeners lamented its introduction as a step backward. For a solo performance such as a classical piano piece, or for a vocal number in which the singer was situated front centre, the early recording devices prove adequate, if just barely, in conveying the essence of live music. For the ensemble music, such as New Orleans or Chicago-style jazz, the clarity of the individual instruments was greatly compromised. Although the rhythm, melody and harmony are there for the careful listener to hear, or even to notate, the subtleties of the tone are all but lost. For an artist like Beiderbecke, for whom quality and texture of sound were almost as important as the actual notes played, the resulting records are little more than a simulacrum of the actual performance. But like sailors peering into murky waters, we find that though we may not be able to measure Beiderbecke's genius in precise fathoms, even this indistinct ebb and flow gives little doubt that it is ever so deep and broad. Between the first and second 1924 sessions with the Wolverines, Beiderbecke celebrated his 21st birthday. Strange to say, though Bix was barely out of his teens, the cornetist was poised to enter the middle period of his career. Indeed, the chronology of this celebrated musician is all too compact. His early recorded oeuvre would span less than 7 years. His entire recorded oeuvre would span less than 7 years, with even this abbreviated history broken down into several distinct stages. By the time of Bix's final recordings with the Wolverines in late 1924, the band had already travelled to New York, at almost the same time that Armstrong moved there to join Henderson. Before the close of the year, Beiderbecke had left the band to embark on a fertile period of freelancing and experimentation. These halcyon days, which lasted from the middle of the decade to the stock market crash in 1929, witnessed much of Beiderbecke's greatest work. But this period also encompassed an exceptionally flourishing of improvised music on much wider scale, one that musical historians have come to designate simply as Chicago jazz. Beiderbecke's contributions, as great as they are, were just one facet of this new sound, this new style. Like the New Orleans tradition that preceded it, and the swing era offerings that followed it, Chicago jazz was not just the music of a time and place, but also of a timeless style of performance, and for its exponents, very much a way of life, one that continues to reverberate to this day to the work of countless Dixieland and traditional jazz bands around the world. For many listeners, the Chicago style remains nothing less than the quintessential sound of jazz.